On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, I welcome you back to JLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed our earlier sessions with Margaret Atwood, Oran Pamuk, Chumpa Lahiri, Yotam Ottolenghi, Rupi Kaur, Ajit Lalwani, Marcus de Sotoy, Pranay Lal, and so many others, you can catch these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. To tell you more about the stellar list of writers we've got lined up for you, please welcome festival directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple.
We are all of us so absolutely delighted by the enthusiastic response from around the world to our stellar new series, JLF, Brave New World. We look at the new life that all of us have to begin, the journey ahead, the learnings, the unlearnings through these sessions on books, on ideas, on mechanisms to cope with and to understand how things are turning around after the pandemic. I urge all of you to listen in to us, to engage with us, to send your suggestions, and to join the Brave New World.
Hi there, we've put together an incredible literary festival for you online, JLF Brave New World. All the writers we love most at Jaipur, Peter Frankopan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Margaret Atwood, have been joined by a whole galaxy of stars we've never dreamt of actually getting to the festival. People like Peter Carey, Evan Duval, Alain de Botton. It's an incredible lineup. Orhan Pamuk, Neil Gaiman, really, it just goes on and on and on. Come and join us, Brave New World, every Wednesday, Saturday and Sunday evening on a phone or laptop near you.
Thank you, Namita. Thank you, William. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our session today on JLF's Brave New World is Writing Under Lockdown. Tahmima Anam in conversation with Sandip Roy. Unfortunately, Sandip Roy is not going to be able to join us because he's in Calcutta, pretty much locked down because of the cyclone. Tahmima Anam, together with writer and journalist, was supposed to take us on a journey of her writing process under lockdown and dwells on the importance of the written word in such perilous times. Tahmima Anam is the author of the Bengal trilogy, A Golden Age, The Good Muslim, and The Bones of Grace. She is the recipient of a Commonwealth Writers' Prize, an O. Henry Prize, and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Her new novel, The Startup Wife, will be published in summer 2021. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section, and do follow our handles JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, or we drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, or of course, you can find us on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, Writing Under Lockdown, Tahmima Anam in conversation. Tahmima, welcome all the way from, where are you right now? You in London?
I'm in East London. I'm in Hackney.
Wow. And do you know if your family is safe in Bangladesh in their apartment building?
They are. I talk to them every day. We're very sad not to be able to see each other. It's kind of reminding me of when I started university in America. I was 17 and I moved to this small town in Massachusetts, and I could only afford to see my parents once a year at the most, once every other year. And obviously, as I've gotten older and I moved to London, we've seen each other more often. Now there's grandchildren involved, so they come and visit. And it's feeling like that time when, months would go by, possibly even years before I could see my family. So I miss them very much, but thankfully they're all safe.
In many ways, your lockdown, or the lockdown that we are all facing right now, you've had many different kinds of lockdowns in your really fabulous journey ever since you were 2, when you went from Bangladesh with your parents and relocated to Paris. Will you tell us a little bit about your early years, and so that set the stage for our later conversation in terms of how you're dealing with the situation today?
Oh, I mean, I in terms of, it's interesting talking about lockdown. I think, if you move with your parents to a new country when you're very young, and in my case, we moved to Paris. My parents obviously didn't speak French. They had never left Bangladesh. We stayed home a lot, because the outside world was quite scary. And Paris in the 70s is not the Paris of today. It was very intimidating. There was a lot of racism. So I do remember that feeling of being a very tight nuclear family. And ever since the lockdown, my husband and I and our two children have been in our house, haven't really left the house except for absolutely essential food shopping. And frankly, it's been kind of a privilege because it's brought us closer together. Nobody goes to the office. Our children have access to us all the time. I don't know if we'll ever be able to go back to a world where we say, well, I'm going to work now, sweetie. I won't see you for the next 8 hours. I think that time is over.
Talking about the lockdown in Paris, when you came back to Bangladesh, I think at the age of 15 or 16, and you went to school, I think in Bangladesh, your father decided to set up a press, a newspaper. And even when you went to school, there was again that sense of perhaps alienation because you were saying things or questioning the former regime, which perhaps was not the done thing even at that time.
I mean, I did feel a profound sense of loneliness when I went home, and it was worse because we had been looking forward to this. So my parents had always said to me, we lived in Paris, we lived in New York, we moved to Thailand, and they would always say, we're not staying. We're always going to just go home eventually. And our lives were oriented around the return home. And it was this long awaited thing that we had anticipated in my whole childhood. And when it finally happened, it was kind of terrible because I felt deeply distanced from that Bangladesh. It was certainly not the Bangladesh that my parents had grown up in. It had changed so much. So for me, it was quite a shock, and particularly because I was supposed to love it, but I didn't.
Your relationship with Bangladesh has always been sort of quite complex, hasn't it? I mean, on one hand, much of your creative content and all your stories in many ways are set and based and sort of fueled by that creative passion that's there. And yet, on the other hand, there is a sense of alienation, and you're perhaps far more comfortable away from the land that's supposed to be yours but is not.
Yeah, and I think that's true for a lot of people who are exiled in some form or another. On the one hand, it's absolutely the source of all of my creative output over the last decade. And I feel enormously grateful. I remember I took I did a master's in creative writing about 15 years ago. And I remember sitting around the room with a bunch of other people who are all Londoners, and people were really struggling with what they were going to write about. And I never struggle with that because, Bangladesh is like teeming with stories. It's a kind of wealth of stories. So I feel incredibly privileged that I have a history and a context that I can really draw on and a richness there. I think on the other hand, I had to accept, and I think as we get older, we accept our limitations. And I had to accept that I was never going to feel like a fully fledged citizen of that place, even though it has granted me an enormous amount. And it has given me a kind of a context through which I write. But as a place, I think I'm always going to have a kind of mixed relationship to it, like anybody who's grown up outside the country of their birth.
Your own upbringing within the compound where you lived in a joint family with all your uncles and cousins, etc., and then in many ways you left that and you traveled to the United States where you studied. Did that distance of not being there with this whole hurly-burly of life, is that what fueled your perspective?
I mean, I think it's difficult to know exactly, but I do think that I wrote that first book as a way of claiming a place that I didn't feel like I fully belonged to. And so I wrote about the most iconic moment in that country's history. And it was a way for me to say, well, I wasn't there, and my Bangla is terrible, and people are constantly questioning, or I am constantly questioning my sense of belonging, but I wrote this book. And that it's like a stake. It was like buying a piece of land, a piece of real estate that I could own. And ever since I wrote that book, I have had a different relationship to Bangladesh. And I have, in fact, felt more comfortable saying, you know what? This was one story. I'm so grateful to have been able to write it. There are hundreds of other stories, many more that are written from the perspective of people who lived through that war and who live in Bangladesh today, and who are the kind of, much more sort of grounded citizens of that place. That's not who I am. And also feeling comfortable with the fact that I wrote it in English. So when I went back to Bangladesh, the number one question people asked me were, why didn't you write the book in Bangla? And my answer was always, oh, I'm so ashamed. I wish I could have written it in Bangla. And now, 10, 12 years on, I can say, it's okay. I wrote in English. That is my medium. That is my tool. And I accept that. I'm not ashamed of that.
Was there a sense of duty that you had to do this sort of pay tribute to your land, or the land that you were always sort of told that this is your place, this is your culture, this is your food, this is your language?
I did. In fact, I had somebody who was critiquing my work once who said, stop being so dutiful. And I did and do feel an enormous responsibility. I think that I have a platform. I think that I have privilege, and it's my responsibility to tell certain stories, which doesn't mean that I'm the only person who can tell those stories. It's just that I have the privilege of telling them. So I do feel an enormous sense of responsibility. But again, my last novel was going further and further away, both generationally and geographically, from Bangladesh. And the novel that I've just finished is set entirely in New York. So it's sort of like accepting that the relationship is, it's complex. It has its ambiguities, and doesn't necessarily have to be a full commitment to a particular place or a particular moment in time.
Lockdown, and that's what we're supposed to be talking about. Lockdown finally is about home and identity, meaning you're locked down in a particular place and you're sort of discovering, in many ways, your inner identity, not just the identity of the sum of your parts. Has that changed in this 2 months or in the process? Because it certainly changed in your third novel, where you introduced, in many ways, a distant land, another person, another voice, quite different from novels 1 and 2. But going into your fourth novel, and even now, even as we speak in this 2 months, how is that sort of processed in your mind?
So I would say that the one experience that fundamentally changed me as a writer was the birth of my first child. So my son Rumi, who is almost 7, was born 3 months premature. And he spent 2 months in a neonatal intensive care unit. And he wasn't ill. So at no point did we think he wasn't going to make it. But we had to wait until he was ready to come out. And I guess an incubator is like the ultimate form of isolation. At a time when you're home to hold your baby, this child spent a lot of his life alone in an incubator. And it really changed the way that my relationship to my writing. So the first thing, obviously, and this is true for any parent, my kind of fantasy about how I was going to write alone in some kind of, soundproofed room and having acres of time, that obviously will never be the same. But also, I found it very difficult to write about some of the very dark things that were the subjects of my first 2 novels. The death of children, war, rape, those very heavy things. And I found it incredibly difficult to go back to those places, because I had felt this profound darkness of fearing for my very fragile baby. So the book that I just finished is, have you been seeing those Instagram photos of Delgado coffee? Do you know what that is?
Mm-hmm.
The really frothy, sweet
Yeah.
coffee. Yeah, so my new novel is my Delgado coffee. And whereas before maybe I was like writing espresso or something, this is the frothy, sweet. It's still me and it still has its politics because obviously, that's who I am. But it was such a relief to do that because I just I didn't have to experience some of the traumas that you have to live through when you write about trauma.
How do you take, I mean, in many ways, your parents were very steeped in socialism. And your
Mhm.
mother, I think, even now is part of a human rights organization. Your sister
Yes.
still works with an NGO. So when you go to a place like the UK, which in many ways compared to a Bangladesh, where is very sterile, pretty much like the nursery
Yeah.
you had to visit. How does that then impact on the way that you process work or the way that you process words, let alone work?
Well, I mean, I think that writers often will go back to a source. And my source is those years with those socialists. And that's really where I will always write from. And that political backbone will always underpin all of my writing. And when you grow up in a family where around the table, all the talk is about politics, all the talk is about human rights, that's all anybody cares about. Before we moved to Bangladesh, the conversation was like, what is our responsibility to Bangladesh? And my parents, now I realize now, they were so young, although they seemed enormous to me when I was a child. They seemed so old. They were processing having lived through a revolution in their teens and 20s, and feeling that sense of authoring a new world, authoring a country, authoring a society. They went from being non-citizens to citizens by acts that they committed themselves. And I think that no matter where I live, that is always going to be the kind of scaffolding around which everything is going to be based. I will never shed that. Having said that, I live a life that couldn't be further from, Rehana's life or the life of the garment factory worker that was in my last short story. And when I write those stories, it's really important for me to kind of immerse myself in those worlds. I spend a lot of time in Bangladesh when we're not in lockdown. It's always the source for me, except in this
In
last
your,
book.
in your second novel, Tahmima, you look at the hull of the ship, and as it's being stripped away, every part is being stripped away in this very large place where they break ships down, and you talk about the whale, and the fact that the whale is the only mammal that's been between land and water, and many of us originate from there. The economy, in the way that you've sort of looked at it, in the sense of the ship, sitting in London in your what is obviously a very contained apartment, a very beautiful space, how do you sort of then match that? How do you bring that back into perspective? Because your life in London is so different. And even in the third book, the way that you've looked at it, you have brought each of these aspects to play. The economies of two completely different lands, etc. So how does that play out? And I know that in this new book, I'm assuming that you've talked about the startup wife. You've looked at your new life and your husband's new work as well.
Yeah, I mean, we all commit acts of the imagination. And I spent a lot of time in Chittagong in the shipyards. I talked to a lot of people who worked in the shipyards, people who work in human rights, who work with those workers. And, that I use that. I mean, I use that research. And as novelists, we take little details and we're like magpies and we stitch them all together. And I, in my kind of spirit, I had to travel back to that place while I was writing. I wrote the novel not at home because I had a small child in a tiny apartment then, but in a co-working space. So it was a friend of my husband's. He runs this kind of, flexible working space, and he let me have a desk there for free for 1 year. Really nice guy. His name's Rohan, and it was the most beautiful space. It had the rule about that space is that it had no straight lines. So everything was these undulating curves, beautiful mid-century modern furniture, and people who were starting companies. And I used to put on my headphones and then occasionally take them off and go into this little world. And I once overheard this guy saying to his partner, I said the words digital and storytelling, and she just threw money at me. And I thought, wow, this is such a different world than the one I'm writing about. But, that's what I had to do. I couldn't be in Bangladesh. My life is here, and I had a small child at home, so I had to be among these young, kind of techie startup people who were spending millions of dollars on digital storytelling while I was telling my very analog story with my headphones. But, that's what we do. We make our spaces.
So do you need to leave to go somewhere else each time you start writing?
I think now as a parent, I just go where I can. And I have to just, I can't have any standards, basically. I used to have so many rules. I wrote my first book longhand in a series of notebooks that my husband had collaged for me. And I just think back and I think, oh my God, who does that? If you ask me now, like, what do you need to write? I don't need anything. I just need, 20 minutes here and there to kind of scribble things down. I need a few hours. And then at the end, obviously, as you know, in writing, the magic happens in the editing. So you need your time to go back and again. But yeah, I left the house at the time because I had to and because somebody gave me a free desk. And this time I didn't have the desk, so I just did it kind of, at the dining table, pushing all the little bits of baby food aside.
So now coming to writing in lockdown, and as you are, how do you see the world progressing around you? Are you writing right now that you've just finished the...
Yeah, so it was so interesting. I had the final draft of my novel was due 2 months ago. And as we careened towards lockdown, I realized I just didn't have time. And I was trying to figure out how I was going to homeschool our kids. And my husband and I were in intense bilateral talks about who was going to take the children when. I'm sure many people have this experience now. And so I said, I need more time. And then the lockdown happened, and I called my editor and I said, I can't do it. I can't write a book about contemporary technological life in New York City now that there's a lockdown. What is the point? It's not that I'm writing my first novel, which is a novel that had to be written. I'm writing a rom-com set in New York. Who cares? We're having the apocalypse is here. Who cares? And obviously she, talked me off of that ledge. And then we had to address the very thorny issue of, was I going to put COVID in the novel? And it was a really big decision. And at first I was like, no, I can't deal with it. Then I thought, it's going to look ridiculous if I don't, because it's about the present. And so then we made a compromise, and I decided to end the novel just before the lockdown in New York. So about the virus and about COVID, but because we're not on the other side of it, I didn't feel that I could write that story. We don't know. It could be years before there's a vaccine. This could be our life. Lockdown opening for a generation. We don't know. Our children might never go back to school. So I was really feeling an enormous sense of anxiety trying to portray a reality that is so unknown. But anyway, I did what I could, and I submitted the book last Friday, and we'll see what happens.
Wow, that sounds amazing. One of the things you said, the whole thing about anxiety and fear is what's really driven us, and our governments and our people and all of us in this period. And yet, when we look around, we know that this is not the first pandemic. It's certainly not going to be the last. And each time we seem to be unprepared for what's to come. Our governments are unprepared. Our reactions are unprepared. Our hospitals are unprepared. And that underlying anxiety, we all have a scaredy cat anxiety gene, as Dr. Sharad Paul keeps saying. But how does that affect your trying to deal with babies, schooling, husband, personal life and space, cooking, cleaning, getting it out to the publisher?